When the high-powered attorney mocked the old farmer's simple appearance and lack of education, his calm response revealed a shocking truth that left the entire courtroom gasping and the judge staring in disbelief. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The county courthouse in Millfield was unusually crowded that Tuesday morning. Summer heat pushed through the tall windows, making the ancient ceiling fans work overtime as they stirred the humid air. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of curious onlookers who had gathered to witness the day's proceedings. Case number 47 had drawn particular interest. A dispute between Willowbrook Development Corporation and Thomas Jenkins, a 68-year-old farmer whose family had worked the same plot of land for generations. The corporation claimed Jenkins was illegally diverting water from a stream that they now owned, affecting their plans to build a luxury housing community. Judge Eleanor Martinez, known throughout the county for her no-nonsense approach and fair rulings, called the courtroom to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel. Her steel-grey hair and penetrating gaze commanded immediate respect as the murmurs in the courtroom subsided. The court will now hear Willowbrook Development Corporation versus Jenkins, she announced, her voice clear and authoritative. Are both parties present and ready to proceed? From the plaintiff's table rose Alexander Pierce, the lead attorney for Willowbrook. His tailored charcoal suit complemented his perfectly groomed appearance. At 42, Pierce had built a reputation as one of the most formidable corporate lawyers in the state. His confident smile revealed teeth whitened to perfection as he adjusted his designer tie. Alexander Pierce, representing Willowbrook Development Corporation, Your Honor. We are prepared to proceed. His voice carried the polished resonance of someone accustomed to commanding rooms much larger than this country courthouse. Across the aisle sat Thomas Jenkins, who rose slowly to his feet. His weathered hands, darkened by decades under the sun and calloused from endless labor, contrasted sharply with Pierce's manicured appearance. Jenkins wore his Sunday best, a clean but clearly aged suit that had been carefully pressed for the occasion. His thinning white hair was neatly combed, and despite the gravity of the situation, his blue eyes held a quiet dignity. Thomas Jenkins, Your Honor. I'm representing myself today. His voice, though softer than Pierce's, carried the solid weight of someone who chose his words with care. Judge Martinez nodded. Mr. Pierce, as the plaintiff, you may present your opening statement. Pierce strode confidently to the center of the courtroom, turning to face both the judge and the jury of 12 local residents. His movements were practiced and precise, like a performer who had rehearsed his role countless times. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the case before you today is straightforward. Pierce gestured smoothly as he spoke. Willowbrook Development Corporation legally purchased the northern stretch of Oak Ridge Creek and surrounding lands from the Simmons estate last year. The purchase included all water rights associated with the property, properly filed and recorded. With the county, Pierce walked slowly before the jury, making eye contact with each member. Since acquiring this property, Willowbrook has invested considerable resources in planning an eco-conscious residential community that will bring jobs and economic growth to Millfield County. However, these plans have been repeatedly hindered by the defendant, Mr. Jenkins. Pierce turned slightly, directing the jury's attention to Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins has constructed an unauthorized irrigation system that diverts significant water from Oak Ridge Creek before it reaches Willowbrook's property. This diversion has caused demonstrable harm to my client's investment and development timeline. Pierce paused dramatically. We will present evidence showing that Mr. Jenkins was formally notified of his violation on 3 separate occasions. We offered to work with him to find alternative water sources for his farm, but Mr. Jenkins has stubbornly refused all reasonable accommodation. The attorney returned to his table to retrieve a document, which he held up for emphasis. We have detailed hydrological reports, satellite imagery, and expert testimony that will prove beyond any doubt that Mr. Jenkins's actions constitute illegal water diversion under state law, resulting in damages exceeding $450,000 to my client. Pierce's voice took on a tone of rehearsed compassion. While we respect Mr. Jenkins's long history in this community, the law is clear. No one, regardless of how long they've lived somewhere, has the right to take resources that legally belong to others. We ask this court to order Mr. Jenkins to cease all diversion activities immediately and to compensate Willowbrook for damages incurred. As Pierce returned to his seat, a satisfied smile played on his lips. The courtroom remained silent. Many spectators nodding along with the compelling presentation. Judge Martinez turned to Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, your opening statement? Thomas Jenkins stood slowly, his joints protesting after years of hard labor. Unlike Pierce, he remained beside his table, one hand resting on the wooden surface for support. He didn't have notes or visual aids, just the simplicity of his words. Your Honor, members of the jury, I thank you for your time today. His voice was steady but unembellished. I'm not a lawyer or a businessman. I'm just a farmer who's worked the same land my grandfather purchased in 1923. Jenkins paused, looking around at the familiar faces in the courtroom. Many were neighbors who had known him their entire lives. I understand Willowbrook believes I'm taking water that belongs to them. I'm here to explain why that isn't so. From the plaintiff's table, Pierce looked on with barely concealed amusement, exchanging knowing glances with his junior associates. One of them leaned over and whispered something that made Pierce smile and shake his head slightly. The spectators noticed this exchange, and a few whispers rippled through the crowd. Judge Martinez cast a stern look toward the Willowbrook table, silencing them instantly. Jenkins continued, unperturbed by the lawyer's dismissive attitude. For nearly 100 years, my family has used water from what Mr. Pierce calls Oak Ridge Creek. In our community, we've always known it as Jenkins Stream, named after my grandfather who helped map the county's waterways back in the 1930s. As he spoke, Jenkins' normally quiet demeanor began to show flashes of the passion that had sustained him through decades of drought, flood, and hardship. I don't dispute that Willowbrook bought the Simmons property. What I dispute is that they bought rights to water that was never the Simmons to sell. Pierce's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of confusion replacing his confident smile. He whispered something to his associate, who began rifling through documents. Judge Martinez leaned forward, her interest visibly piqued. Continue, Mr. Jenkins. Your Honor, I've brought my own evidence today. Not fancy reports or satellite pictures, but something I believe holds more weight in this courtroom. The elderly farmer reached slowly into his worn jacket pocket, his weathered hands emerging with a folded document that showed the yellowish tinge of age. The courtroom fell into a deeper silence, curiosity spreading across the faces of everyone present, including Alexander Pierce, whose confident demeanor had begun to show the first signs of uncertainty. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas Jenkins carefully unfolded the yellow document, handling it with the reverence one might show a sacred text. The paper crackled softly in the hushed courtroom, its sound amplified by the collective held breath of the spectators. He cleared his throat before continuing. Before I explain this document, Your Honor, I'd like to ask Mr. Pierce a question, if that's permitted. Judge Martinez considered this unusual request for a moment. Normally, examination of opposing counsel is not standard procedure, Mr. Jenkins. However, she paused, studying the elderly farmer's earnest expression. I'll allow a limited question relevant to your opening statement. Jenkins nodded gratefully. Thank you, Your Honor. He turned to face Alexander Pierce. Mr. Pierce, in preparing your case, did you or your firm conduct a comprehensive title search on the water rights for what you call Oak Ridge Creek? Pierce straightened his tie, visibly annoyed at being questioned by someone he clearly considered his intellectual inferior. Of course we did, Mr. Jenkins. Willowbrook Development Corporation employs only the most thorough due diligence procedures. We traced the title back 60 years, well beyond the standard 30-year requirement. Jenkins nodded thoughtfully. 60 years. I see. His weathered face revealed nothing as he turned back to the judge. Oh, Your Honor, the document I'm holding is a water rights decree issued by this very court in 1937, 88 years ago. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Pierce's junior associate leaned forward, suddenly alert, whispering urgently to his superior. May I approach the bench to present this document? Jenkins asked. Judge Martinez nodded. You may. As Jenkins walked forward, Pierce stood abruptly. Your Honor, I object to this irregular presentation of evidence. Any relevant documents should have been disclosed during discovery. Judge Martinez fixed Pierce with a stern gaze. Mr. Pierce, as you well know, Mr. Jenkins is representing himself. While he may not have followed proper procedure for discovery, fundamental fairness requires that I at least examine what he believes to be relevant to his defense. She turned to Jenkins. However, Mr. Jenkins, I must caution you that failure to provide proper disclosure may limit how this document can be used. Jenkins nodded respectfully. I understand, Your Honor, and I apologize for my ignorance of proper procedures. Truth is, I didn't know this case would go this far. I thought the truth of the matter would be clear enough without going to trial. He handed the document to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Martinez. She adjusted her reading glasses and began examining it carefully, her expression gradually shifting from professional neutrality to unmistakable interest. Pierce, unable to contain his impatience, addressed the court. Your Honor, while this historical curiosity may be interesting, I fail to see how a document from nearly a century ago could possibly supersede modern property records and transactions. Judge Martinez looked up sharply. Mr. Pierce, I would advise you to reserve judgment until you've seen what I'm looking at. She returned to her examination for another full minute before continuing. This appears to be an original water rights adjudication from 1937, signed by Judge William Hargrove, who was indeed presiding in this district at that time. She looked at Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, please explain to the court your understanding of this document's significance. Jenkins stood straighter now, gaining confidence. Your Honor, this decree establishes what's called prior appropriation water rights for my family. It officially recognizes that my grandfather, Emmett Jenkins, was the first to divert and beneficially use the water from what the document names as Jenkins Stream for agricultural purposes, dating back to 1923. He paused, looking directly at Pierce. In water law, especially in our state, first in time means first in right. This decree establishes my family's senior water rights that predate any claims the Simmons family could have possibly sold to Willowbrook. Pierce was on his feet instantly. Your Honor, this is preposterous. Mr. Jenkins clearly has no legal training, yet he's attempting to lecture the court on complex water rights law. The Simmons property deed clearly includes water rights, registered with the county. Mr. Pierce, Judge Martinez interrupted firmly, I assure you I don't need lectures on water law from either of you. I specialized in natural resources law before taking the bench. She turned to Jenkins. Mr. Jenkins, while this document appears authentic, we need to verify it against court records. More importantly, we need to establish continuous beneficial use of the water since 1937. Prior appropriation rights can be lost through abandonment or non-use. Jenkins nodded calmly. I have tax records showing continuous agricultural production on my property since my grandfather's time, Your Honor. Never once in nearly 100 years has a season gone by when that water wasn't used to grow crops. Pierce, sensing the shift in momentum, adjusted his strategy. His voice took on a condescending tone as he addressed Jenkins directly. Mr. Jenkins, while I admire your rustic understanding of water rights, you're clearly out of your depth here. Perhaps if you had received a proper education you would understand that modern property transactions supersede ancient historical claims. My client has invested millions based on county records that show clear ownership of these water rights. A tense silence fell over the courtroom. Many of the local spectators shifted uncomfortably, offended by Pierce's thinly veiled insult toward a respected community member. Judge Martinez's expression darkened, but before she could admonish Pierce, Jenkins responded. "Mr. Pierce," he began, his voice level and without a trace of anger, "I may not have your fancy law degree or your tailored suit. My education came from working alongside my father from the time I could walk, from serving my country in Vietnam, and from raising 3 children who all graduated college, something I couldn't afford to do myself." Jenkins took a step closer to the lawyer, his quiet dignity a stark contrast to Pierce's arrogant posturing. "But there's one thing I did learn in my 70 years on this earth. There's a difference between intelligence and wisdom, between education and knowledge." The courtroom was utterly silent now, every eye fixed on the elderly farmer as he continued. "You see, Mr. Pierce, while you were studying law books, I was studying the land, how the water flows, how the seasons change, how to coax life from soil that would defeat those with less patience. And while you were building a career tearing things apart with words, I was building something that will outlast both of us." He gestured toward his weathered hands. "These calluses came from work that fed people. Can you say the same about yours?" Several spectators gasped audibly at the simple yet profound question. Even some of the jurors nodded subtly, moved by Jenkins' words. Pierce stood frozen, caught between outrage and the sudden realization that his attack had backfired dramatically. Judge Martinez, though maintaining her professional composure, couldn't entirely hide a flash of approval in her eyes. She tapped her gavel lightly. "I believe we'll take a 15-minute recess while the court reviews this document and determines how to proceed." She fixed Pierce with a stern look. "And when we return, I expect all parties to maintain appropriate professional courtesy as—" The judge exited the courtroom. The gallery erupted in whispers. Pierce retreated to the plaintiff's table, where his associates clustered around him in urgent discussion. Several of them cast nervous glances toward Jenkins, who simply sat down and folded his hands patiently, the perfect picture of a man at peace with himself and his place in the world. From the back of the courtroom, Margaret Simmons, daughter of the late property owner who had sold to Willowbrook, watched the proceedings with growing concern. She leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Dad never mentioned anything about the water rights belonging to the Jenkins family. Do you think he knew?" Her husband shrugged helplessly. "I don't know. But I have a feeling we're about to find out." The 15-minute recess stretched to 30 as Judge Martinez remained in her chambers. The spectators, unwilling to surrender their seats for fear of missing what might come next, stayed put, their hushed conversations filling the courtroom with a constant murmur. At the plaintiff's table, Alexander Pierce's earlier confidence had visibly eroded. He paced back and forth, occasionally stopping to whisper urgently to his associates, who frantically searched through documents and tapped away on laptops. Thomas Jenkins sat alone at the defense table, his weathered hands folded calmly in front of him. Several community members had approached to offer quiet words of support during the recess, each receiving a humble nod and gentle smile in return. Unlike Pierce, Jenkins showed no signs of anxiety. He simply waited, a man accustomed to the patience that farming demands. In the back of the courtroom, Margaret Simmons had moved to sit closer to the proceedings. Her face showed the strain of someone wrestling with an uncomfortable realization. Beside her, County Records clerk Eliza Thompson leaned in to whisper, "I've known about that water decree my entire career, Margaret. Your father must have known, too." Before Margaret could respond, the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise, the Honorable Judge Eleanor Martinez presiding." Judge Martinez returned to the bench, her expression carefully neutral as she surveyed the courtroom. Once seated, she addressed the court directly. "After reviewing the documents submitted by Mr. Jenkins, I've taken the liberty of having the court clerk verify its authenticity against our archived records." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room before settling on Pierce. "The document is indeed genuine. It is a certified water rights decree from 1937, establishing prior appropriation rights for Emmett Jenkins on what was then officially designated as Jenkins Stream." Pierce immediately rose to his feet. "Your Honor, if I may—" "You may not, Mr. Pierce," Judge Martinez interrupted firmly. "Not yet. First, there's another matter to address." She turned toward the gallery. "Ms. Margaret Simmons, would you please approach the bench?" A ripple of surprise moved through the courtroom as Margaret stood, hesitantly making her way forward. Judge Martinez addressed her directly. "Miss Simmons, you are the executor of your late father's estate and responsible for the sale of the property to Willowbrook Development, is that correct?" Margaret nodded, then remembered protocol. "Yes, Your Honor." "Miss Simmons, were you aware of the Jenkins family's water rights when you sold the property?" Margaret's voice wavered slightly. "No, Your Honor, I wasn't personally aware." She glanced toward Jenkins with a mixture of embarrassment and regret. "But I've just learned that this information was apparently in the county records all along." Judge Martinez nodded. "Thank you for your honesty, Miss Simmons. You may return to your seat." The judge then addressed both parties. "This case has taken an unexpected turn. The evidence suggests that Willowbrook may have purchased water rights that the Simmons estate did not legally possess in the first place. However, before we proceed further, I want to hear from both parties regarding this development." Pierce was already on his feet, his composure somewhat recovered, but a new tension evident in his posture. "Your Honor, while this historical document is certainly interesting, it doesn't invalidate my client's purchase. The water rights were explicitly included in the deed filed with the county when Willowbrook acquired the property. If there was an error, it occurred decades ago and has been perpetuated through multiple property transactions. My client is an innocent purchaser who relied on county records." He adjusted his tie, continuing with renewed confidence. "Furthermore, even if this decree was valid in 1937, water rights can be abandoned or modified. Mr. Jenkins has presented no evidence of continuous beneficial use as required by state law to maintain such rights. His claims amount to nothing more than nostalgic attachment to land his family once controlled. In today's world, development and progress cannot be held hostage by outdated claims." Judge Martinez turned to Jenkins. "Mr. Jenkins, your response?" Thomas Jenkins rose slowly, his movements deliberate as he picked up a worn leather folder from his table. "Your Honor, I anticipated Mr. Pierce might question whether my family has continuously used our water rights." He extracted several documents. From the folder, I have here tax records dating back to 1940, showing agricultural production every single year. I also have annual water usage reports filed with the County Water Commissioner from 1951 to the present. Jenkins handed the documents to the bailiff. "These records show that my family has never abandoned our water rights, not for a single growing season. We've maintained the same irrigation systems, improved them when needed, and used them exactly as my grandfather described in his original appropriation claim. As Judge Martinez examined these additional documents, Jenkins continued, "Your Honor, there's something else that might explain how this misunderstanding occurred." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out another folded paper. "This is a copy of a letter my father sent to Robert Simmons, Margaret's father, in 1978, explicitly informing him that our water rights predated his property purchase and would remain with our family regardless of any future land transactions along the stream." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Margaret Simmons visibly paled. "The letter includes a signed acknowledgement from Robert Simmons, recognizing our senior water rights," Jenkins concluded. "They were neighbors for 40 years and had an understanding. I believe Mr. Simmons simply failed to disclose this arrangement when he passed the property to his daughter." Pierce was practically vibrating with frustration. "Your Honor, this is completely irregular. More surprise evidence that wasn't properly disclosed. These are precisely the tactics that proper legal procedure is designed to prevent. My client has invested millions based on county records that showed no encumbrances on these water rights." Judge Martinez raised her hand to silence him. "Mr. Pierce, I understand your frustration. However, the preliminary evidence suggests there may be serious deficiencies in Willowbrook's title to these water rights." She reviewed the documents once more before continuing. "Here's how we'll proceed. I'm temporarily suspending all development activities by Willowbrook that involve water usage from the disputed stream until we can fully verify these documents and their implications. I'll schedule a full evidentiary hearing for 2 weeks from today, where both parties can present comprehensive evidence regarding the water rights history." She turned to Pierce. "Mr. Pierce, I suggest you advise your client to conduct a more thorough investigation into the title history, going back beyond the standard 60 years. And Mr. Jenkins," she continued, looking toward the farmer, "you will need to provide all documentation supporting your continuous use claim to Mr. Pierce's team no later than 3 days from now." Pierce wasn't finished. His face flushed with barely contained anger. He addressed Jenkins directly. "Mr. Jenkins, I find it telling that you conveniently waited until my client had invested millions before bringing forward these supposed historical claims. One might almost suspect this is less about water rights and more about extracting a settlement from a deep-pocketed developer." Before Judge Martinez could intervene, Jenkins responded calmly. "Mr. Pierce, my family has never been in the business of taking what isn't rightfully ours. I approached your client 3 times when they first purchased the property, trying to explain the situation. Each time, I was turned away by your associates, who insisted they had handled all the legal issues. I only came to court when your client threatened to bulldoze the irrigation channels my grandfather dug by hand nearly a century ago." The quietness of Jenkins's response only highlighted the contrast between the two men. One furious and defensive, the other composed and measured. Judge Martinez tapped her gavel. "That's enough. This court is adjourned until the evidentiary hearing 2 weeks from today. I expect both parties to conduct themselves professionally in the interim." As she rose to leave, she added, "And Mr. Pierce, a word of advice. In matters of water rights in this county, it's often worth looking beyond the standard title search. Some of our most important historical records aren't digitized or indexed in modern systems." As the courtroom began to empty, Jenkins gathered his documents with care. Pierce stormed out with his legal team in tow, already barking instructions about emergency research and contingency plans. Margaret Simmons hesitantly approached Jenkins. "Mr. Jenkins," she began, her voice thick with emotion, "I had no idea about any of this. My father never mentioned your family's water rights when he was explaining the property to me." Jenkins looked up at her kindly. Your father and mine had an understanding, Margaret. They were both men who believed a handshake meant something. I suspect he thought that understanding would continue without needing formal paperwork. I feel terrible, she admitted. If I had known, I would have made sure Willowbrook understood the situation before the sale. Jenkins patted her hand gently. Don't blame yourself. Robert was a good neighbor for decades. He respected the land and its history. He paused, looking past her to where the Willowbrook executives were huddled near the courtroom doors. Not everyone shares that respect these days. As Jenkins walked out of the courtroom, several community members stopped to shake his hand and pat him on the back. The county clerk, Eliza Thompson, approached with a smile. Thomas, I nearly fell out of my chair when you pulled out that decree, she said. I've seen it in our archives, but I never thought it would become the center of a case like this. Jenkins smiled. My grandfather always told me to keep important papers close, said you never know when the past might need to teach the present a lesson. From across the courthouse lobby, Pierce watched this exchange with narrowed eyes. His client, Willowbrook's CEO, Richard Harmon, demanded answers. How did we miss this, Pierce? You assured me the water rights were clean. Pierce's jaw tightened. Standard title searches only go back 60 years. This decree is from 1937. We followed normal procedure. Well, your normal procedure just cost us millions in potential delays, Harmon snapped. Fix this. I don't care how. As they exited the courthouse, Pierce cast one last glance at Jenkins, who was now surrounded by well-wishers. The lawyer's expression hardened into resolve. This battle was far from over, but for the first time in his career, Alexander Pierce found himself questioning whether he was fighting on the right side. The 2 weeks before the evidentiary hearing passed in a flurry of activity for both sides of the case. Alexander Pierce had transformed the conference room at his firm's offices into a war room dedicated solely to the Jenkins case. The long mahogany table disappeared beneath stacks of documents, land surveys, and water rights legal precedents. 3 paralegals had been reassigned to work exclusively on researching historical property records, and a water rights specialist from the state capital had been brought in as a consultant. Pierce himself had barely left the office. The stubble on his face had grown into the beginnings of an unintentional beard, and dark circles had formed under his eyes. His usual immaculate appearance had given way to rolled-up sleeves and loosened ties. This case had become personal, a challenge to his professional reputation that he couldn't afford to lose. What do you mean you can't find any record of abandonment? Pierce snapped at a junior associate who had just delivered yet another disappointing update. There has to be some period where the Jenkins family failed to use the water appropriately. No one maintains perfect continuity for nearly a century. The associate shrunk back slightly. We've checked agricultural tax filings, aerial surveys dating back to the 1950s, and county water commissioner reports. Every year shows active irrigation and crop production, even during the drought of '77, when most farmers in the area had to reduce their water usage. Pierce ran his hands through his disheveled hair in frustration. What about the letter Jenkins produced? Have we verified its authenticity? The handwriting analysis just came back, another team member reported. The signature appears to be authentic. It matches other known examples of Robert Simmons' signature from county records. Pierce paced the length of the conference room, his mind racing. There has to be something we're missing. Nobody's case is this perfect. He stopped suddenly, turning to the water rights specialist. What about over-appropriation? If Jenkins diverted more water than his original decree allowed, we could argue for a partial reduction of his rights. The specialist, Dr. Eleanor Walsh, shook her head. I've reviewed the annual usage reports. The Jenkins farm has consistently used exactly the amount specified in the 1937 decree, not a drop more. Thomas Jenkins keeps meticulous records of his water usage. It's actually quite impressive. Pierce slammed his hand on the table in frustration, causing several document stacks to topple. Damn it, our client has invested millions based on our legal assessment of those water rights. If we lose this case, the liability could be enormous. There's something else, Dr. Walsh added hesitantly. I've been looking at the county's historical maps. The stream was officially renamed from Jenkins Stream to Oak Ridge Creek in a county resolution in 1986. But the resolution explicitly stated that the renaming does not affect existing water rights or claims. Pierce stopped pacing and sank into a chair, loosening his tie further. For the first time in his career, he was facing the possibility that he might be on the wrong side of both the law and justice. The realization was profoundly unsettling. "Get Richard Harmon on the phone," he finally said to his assistant. "We need to discuss settlement options." Meanwhile, across town, Thomas Jenkins' preparation couldn't have looked more different. His kitchen table held just a few neatly organized folders, one containing the water rights decree, another with his tax and water usage records, and a third with photographs documenting his family's continuous stewardship of the land. Jenkins wasn't alone, however. Word of his courtroom exchange with Pierce had spread throughout the community, and several unexpected allies had appeared to offer assistance. County historian Mary Blackwell sat across from him, helping organize historical references to Jenkins' stream. Retired Judge Samuel Cooper, who had served on the bench for 30 years before Martinez, had volunteered legal guidance. And surprisingly, Margaret Simmons herself had arrived with a box of her father's personal papers. "I found these in Dad's study after our conversation at the courthouse," she explained, carefully laying out several journals on the table. "He kept detailed diaries about the farm and his interactions with neighbors. There are multiple entries about your father and your family's water rights." Jenkins opened one of the leather-bound journals, his weathered finger carefully tracing the handwritten entries from decades past. He stopped at an entry from April 1972. "Met with Henry Jenkins today about the stream boundary. Reminded him, as his father reminded mine, that the water rights belong to the Jenkins family, regardless of property lines. Agreed to maintain the current arrangement that has served both our families well. A man's word still means something in this county, even if the lawyers would have us put everything in triplicate on official letterhead." Jenkins smiled softly. "That sounds just like your father. He was a man who understood the old ways." Margaret nodded, her eyes moist. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Jenkins. When Dad passed and I inherited the property, I had no idea about any of this. I live 3 states away and haven't been involved with the farm for years. When Willowbrook made their offer, it seemed like the practical decision." "You couldn't have known," Jenkins reassured her. "Robert and I had an understanding that went beyond paperwork. That's how things were done in our generation." Judge Cooper, who had been examining the water decree, looked up. "This diary could be crucial evidence, Thomas. It directly supports your claim that the Simmons family was fully aware of your water rights." Mary Blackwell nodded in agreement. "I found references to Jenkins Stream in county historical records dating back to the 1920s. The name appears in school textbooks, local histories, and even WPA survey documents from the 1930s. The historical record clearly establishes your family's connection to that water source." Jenkins took a sip from his coffee cup, considering the information before him. Unlike Pierce's frantic preparation, his approach was measured and calm. "I never wanted this fight," he said quietly. "All I've ever wanted was to tend my land the same way my father and grandfather did before me." "Well, you may not have wanted the fight, but you're certainly prepared for it," Judge Cooper observed with admiration. "In 40 years on and around the bench, I've rarely seen someone walk into court with such a strong position, especially against the kind of legal firepower Willowbrook has brought in." Mary Blackwell added, "The community is behind you, Thomas. Everyone's talking about how you stood up to that city lawyer." She smiled. My niece said her law professor at State is using your case as an example in his water rights class already. Jenkins shook his head modestly. I'm not looking to be anyone's example. I just want what's rightfully mine. No more, no less. The ringing of Jenkins' landline telephone interrupted their conversation. Jenkins excused himself and went to answer it. The others couldn't hear the conversation, but they watched as Jenkins' expression shifted from surprise to thoughtful consideration. When he returned to the table, there was a new gravity to his demeanor. That was Alexander Pierce, he announced. He wants to meet tomorrow to discuss a potential settlement. The following day, Pierce arrived at Jenkins' farm precisely at the agreed time of 10 a.m. He had made an effort to restore his professional appearance, though the signs of stress remained visible in the tightness around his eyes. As he stepped out of his luxury sedan, the lawyer took a moment to survey the property. The Jenkins farm was modestly sized by modern agricultural standards, about 120 acres of well-maintained fields bordered by mature oak trees. The farmhouse itself was an older two-story structure with a wide front porch, clearly built in another era but meticulously maintained. Unlike the manicured corporate grounds Pierce was accustomed to, this place had a lived-in authenticity that couldn't be manufactured. Jenkins met him on the porch, offering a firm handshake and a glass of fresh lemonade. "Appreciate you making the drive out here, Mr. Pierce." Pierce nodded, accepting the drink. "Thank you for agreeing to meet, Mr. Jenkins. I thought it might be productive to discuss this matter outside the courtroom setting. I've always found that most disagreements look different when you're sitting on a porch rather than in a courtroom," Jenkins replied, gesturing to a pair of wooden rocking chairs overlooking the fields. As they sat, Pierce noticed the irrigation channels that were at the center of their dispute. From this vantage point, he could see how the water was carefully directed across the property, not wastefully, but with precision, born from generations of knowledge about the land's contours and needs. "Mr. Jenkins," Pierce began after taking a sip of lemonade, "after reviewing the evidence you presented and conducting our own further investigation, Willowbrook is prepared to acknowledge your prior appropriation water rights." Jenkins nodded, but remained silent, allowing the lawyer to continue. "We would like to propose a compromise that respects your historical claims while still allowing our development to proceed." Pierce set his glass down on a small table between them. "Willowbrook is prepared to offer you $1.5 million for your water rights, or alternatively, to modify our development plans to ensure you maintain your current water allocation in perpetuity, with certain legal safeguards for both parties." Jenkins rocked gently in his chair, his eyes focused on the distant fields where the irrigation channels sparkled in the morning sun. "That's a generous offer, Mr. Pierce. More money than my family has seen in several generations of farming." Pierce sensed an opening. "It would provide security for you and your heirs, Mr. Jenkins. Farming is becoming increasingly difficult for small operations like yours. This could be an opportunity to secure your future while allowing progress in the community." Jenkins turned to face Pierce directly. "You know, Mr. Pierce, when my grandfather dug those irrigation channels, he wasn't thinking about money. He was thinking about legacy, about creating something that would sustain his family for generations. That water isn't just a resource to me, it's part of a promise handed down from father to son." He gestured toward the fields. "See that south section there? That's where I learned to plow a straight furrow when I was 12 years old. The eastern field is where my son took his first steps while I was harvesting corn. My wife is buried on that small rise beneath the oak trees." His voice remained steady, but the emotion behind his words was unmistakable. "Some things don't have a price tag, Mr. Pierce." Pierce found himself momentarily at a loss for words, confronted with a value system so different from the transactional world he inhabited professionally. Before he could respond, Jenkins continued. That said, I'm not opposed to finding a solution that works for both of us. I don't need all the water all the time. There might be a way to share that respects both our needs. For the first time since their initial courtroom encounter, Pierce felt himself genuinely considering Jenkins not as an opponent to be overcome, but as a person with legitimate concerns and values. It was a perspective shift that made him uncomfortable, yet somehow also relieved. I appreciate your willingness to discuss alternatives, Mr. Jenkins, Pierce said with newfound sincerity. Perhaps we can work toward a more collaborative approach than what I initially envisioned. As the morning sun rose higher over the farm, the two men, so different in background, education, and worldview, began the slow process of finding common ground. And for Alexander Pierce, who had built a career on winning at all costs, it was a rare lesson in the possibility that sometimes the most satisfying resolution might not look like victory in conventional terms. 2 days before the scheduled evidentiary hearing, the Millfield County Courthouse was abuzz with speculation. Word had spread that representatives from both Willowbrook Development Corporation and Thomas Jenkins had requested a meeting with Judge Martinez in her chambers. The courthouse staff exchanged knowing glances as Alexander Pierce arrived with his client, Richard Harmon, followed shortly by Thomas Jenkins, accompanied by retired Judge Cooper. Inside the judge's chambers, the atmosphere was formal but noticeably less adversarial than during their previous court appearance. Judge Martinez studied the faces of those assembled before her. I understand the parties have been engaged in settlement discussions, she began. Have you reached an agreement you'd like to present to the court? Pierce nodded, his demeanor more subdued than before. Yes, Your Honor. After extensive discussion and review of the evidence, Willowbrook Development and Mr. Jenkins have reached a mutually acceptable resolution. He placed a document on the judge's desk. We've prepared a consent decree that acknowledges Mr. Jenkins' senior water rights while establishing a water-sharing arrangement that will accommodate both agricultural needs and responsible development. Judge Martinez raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by this turn of events. She took the document and began reviewing it carefully. The key provisions, Pierce continued, include recognition of the Jenkins family's prior appropriation rights, dating back to 1937, a seasonal allocation schedule that ensures Mr. Jenkins receives full water rights during critical growing periods, and Willowbrook's commitment to implement water conservation technologies in their development to reduce overall consumption. Jenkins spoke up, his voice steady. The agreement also includes protection of the historical irrigation channels on my property and naming rights for the stream, Your Honor. It will officially return to its original name, Jenkins Stream, with appropriate historical markers explaining its significance to the county. Richard Harmon, though clearly not entirely pleased with these concessions, added, Willowbrook has also agreed to modify our development plans to create a 50-acre conservation easement along the stream boundary, preserving the natural watershed. Judge Martinez finished reviewing the document and looked up at the parties with a mixture of surprise and approval. This is quite comprehensive and notably fair to both parties. May I ask what prompted this collaborative approach after such contentious initial proceedings? Pierce and Jenkins exchanged a glance. It was Pierce who answered, though with uncharacteristic humility. Your Honor, after further investigation into the history of Jenkins Stream and the water rights associated with it, it became clear that Mr. Jenkins' claims were substantially valid. He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. Additionally, I had the opportunity to visit Mr. Jenkins' farm and gain a better understanding of what these water rights truly represent beyond their legal definition. Jenkins nodded in agreement. And I came to understand that progress doesn't have to mean erasing history, Your Honor. There's room for both if we're willing to listen to each other. Judge Martinez studied both men thoughtfully before turning her attention back to the document. I'll need time to review this consent decree thoroughly. But I must say, I'm impressed by your ability to find common ground in what appeared to be an intractable dispute. She signed a temporary order accepting the decree pending final review. The court commends both parties for their willingness to work toward a resolution that respects both historical rights and future development. This is precisely the kind of outcome our legal system should encourage. As they exited the judge's chambers, a crowd of reporters had gathered in the courthouse hallway, alerted by courthouse staff that something significant was happening with the high-profile case. Camera flashes illuminated the corridor as Pierce and Jenkins emerged together. "Mr. Pierce, Mr. Jenkins, have you reached a settlement?" called out a reporter from the county newspaper. Pierce glanced at Jenkins, deferring to him to speak first. The elderly farmer stepped forward, his simple dignity a stark contrast to the media circus. "We've found a path forward that honors the past while making room for the future," Jenkins stated, his weathered face solemn. "Jenkins' stream will continue to nourish my fields as it has for nearly a century, and it will also support new homes and families in our growing community." A reporter thrust a microphone toward Pierce. "Mr. Pierce, is this an admission that Willowbrook's original position was flawed? Has your firm conducted an adequate title search?" Pierce straightened his shoulders, meeting the question directly. "Our initial assessment followed standard industry protocols, but this case has been a powerful reminder that standard protocols aren't always sufficient when dealing with historically significant properties and water rights." He glanced at Jenkins before continuing. "More importantly, it's been a reminder that the law works best when it balances technical compliance with fundamental fairness. Willowbrook is satisfied with an agreement that allows development to proceed. While respecting legitimate historical claims, Richard Harmon stepped forward, clearly eager to put a corporate spin on the situation. "Willowbrook Development has always been committed to honoring the communities where we build. Our new plan for Jenkins Stream Estates will showcase how thoughtful development can preserve historical legacy while creating modern living spaces." As the corporate executive continued with practiced talking points about sustainable development and community values, Jenkins quietly stepped away from the media scrum. Pierce noticed and excused himself to follow. He caught up with Jenkins near the courthouse steps. "Mr. Jenkins, there's something I've been meaning to say to you privately." Jenkins paused, turning to face the attorney with a questioning look. "I owe you an apology," Pierce said, the words clearly unfamiliar on his tongue. "My comment about your education was not only unprofessional but profoundly mistaken. You've taught me more about both water law and integrity in the past 2 weeks than I learned in 3 years of law school." A faint smile crossed Jenkins' face. "Apology accepted, Mr. Pierce, though I suspect you're being too hard on yourself and too generous to me." "No," Pierce insisted, "I'm not. When I visited your farm and saw those irrigation channels, the ones your grandfather dug by hand, I realized something that's been missing in my approach to law. I've been so focused on winning cases that I sometimes forget to ask whether I should be fighting them in the first place." Jenkins considered this thoughtfully. "It's never too late to ask better questions, Mr. Pierce." The lawyer nodded, extending his hand. "Please call me Alexander." "Only if you'll call me Thomas," Jenkins replied, shaking Pierce's hand firmly. As they parted ways at the bottom of the courthouse steps, Margaret Simmons approached Jenkins. She had been waiting discreetly throughout the proceedings. "I heard about the settlement," she said. "I just wanted to thank you for not holding my ignorance against me. If I had known about Dad's understanding with your family, I never would have sold those water rights." Jenkins smiled kindly. "Your father was a good man and a good neighbor, Margaret. He would be proud of how you've handled this situation." He patted her hand gently. "Sometimes we have to rediscover the things our parents knew but didn't write down for us." 3 weeks later, A small ceremony was held at the boundary between Jenkins Farm and what would become Jenkins Stream Estates. County officials, local residents and Willowbrook representatives gathered for the unveiling of a historical marker that read. He checked his watch and glanced down the path, looking for a familiar figure. Right on time, he spotted Thomas Jenkins making his way along the trail. The farmer had slowed considerably at 73, walking with the assistance of a carved wooden cane, but his back remained straight and his eyes clear. "Good morning, Thomas," Pierce called out as Jenkins approached. "Alexander," Jenkins nodded in greeting. "Appreciate you making the drive out here. Not often we get a visit from the newly appointed director of the State Water Resources Division." Pierce smiled at the mention of his recent promotion. "Some meetings are worth the trip. Besides, I wanted to see how the model water-sharing agreement is working in practice. Your case has become something of a template for the state." They began, walking together along the path that followed the stream's course. On one side lay the residential development with its carefully designed homes. On the other stretched Jenkins' agricultural fields, green with the promise of a bountiful harvest. "The agreement has held up well," Jenkins confirmed. "The seasonal allocation schedule gives my crops what they need during critical growing periods, and the development's conservation systems have kept overall usage within sustainable limits." Pierce nodded, professionally satisfied but also personally pleased. "The governor mentioned your case specifically when she signed the new Water Rights Preservation Act last month. The Jenkins provision requires historical water claims to be researched beyond the standard title search period." Jenkins chuckled softly. "Never thought I'd have a law named after me. My grandfather would have found that quite amusing." They reached a small gazebo overlooking both the stream and the farmland beyond. Seated inside was a young woman in her early 30s, her notebook open and pen ready. Lisa Chen was a law professor from the State University who had written extensively about the Jenkins case and its implications for water rights law. "Professor Chen," Pierce greeted her, "thank you for joining us. I hope we haven't kept you waiting." "Not at all," she replied, standing to shake hands with both men. "It's an honor to have both of you participate in my research. This case study will be central to the new textbook on environmental resource law." Once seated in the gazebo, Professor Chen began her interview. "Mr. Jenkins, in the 5 years since your case was resolved, how has the arrangement affected your farming operations?" Jenkins considered her question thoughtfully. "The guaranteed water rights during growing season have actually improved my situation. Knowing exactly how much water I can count on has allowed me to plan more effectively. And I've adopted some of the conservation techniques that Willowbrook implemented. Turns out old farmers can learn new methods after all." His eyes twinkled with self-deprecating humor. "And Mr. Pierce," Chen turned to the former attorney, "your career trajectory changed dramatically after this case. Could you elaborate on that decision?" Pierce glanced at Jenkins before responding. "This case made me confront some uncomfortable truths about my approach to the law. I had been trained to see legal disputes as battlegrounds where victory was the only acceptable outcome. But Thomas showed me that sometimes the most durable resolutions come when both parties recognize the legitimacy in each other's position." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "After 20 years of corporate practice, I realized I wanted to help shape policy that balances development needs with preservation of historical rights and environmental resources. The Water Conservation Board offered that opportunity. It's fascinating how a single case can have such profound impacts," Chen observed, making notes. "Mr. Jenkins, your response to Mr. Pierce's initial mockery of your education has become somewhat legendary in legal circles. Was that a prepared statement?" Jenkins laughed, a warm sound that carried across the water. "Heavens, no. When you've lived as long as I have, you don't need to rehearse the truth. I just spoke what I've always known, that wisdom and formal education don't always travel together. Pierce smiled at the memory, no longer embarrassed by his former arrogance. That moment in court has become a personal touchstone for me. I've cited Thomas's words in at least a dozen speeches to law students about the difference between winning arguments and seeking justice. Their conversation continued for over an hour, exploring the technical aspects of the water-sharing agreement and its broader implications for similar disputes. As Professor Chen packed away her materials, she had one final question. The consent decree included an unusual provision for an annual meeting between representatives of Jenkins Farm and Willowbrook Development to assess the agreement's effectiveness. I understand you've both participated in these meetings each year. Why maintain that personal involvement when attorneys or managers could handle it? The two men exchanged a glance that communicated years of mutual respect. Some agreements need more than signatures on paper to maintain them, Jenkins replied. They need continued goodwill and understanding between people. Pierce nodded in agreement. And some relationships, even those born from conflict, become valuable enough to maintain. After Professor Chen departed, Pierce and Jenkins continued their walk along the stream. They passed several residents of the development who greeted Jenkins with warm familiarity. Far from resenting the new community, he had become something of a beloved local figure. The elder statesman whose principles had shaped the development's character. I've been meaning to tell you, Jenkins said as they walked. My granddaughter Emily has decided to take over the farm when I retire. She's finishing her degree in sustainable agriculture at the university this year. Pierce's eyebrows rose in pleasant surprise. That's wonderful news, Thomas. I remember you mentioning you weren't sure if any of your grandchildren would want to continue farming. Jenkins nodded, his expression a mixture of pride and contentment. She grew up hearing the story of our court case. Says it taught her that fighting for what matters can make a difference that lasts beyond your own time. He gestured toward the thriving fields. She's already implementing new methods that improve soil health while reducing water usage. The next generation improving on what we managed to preserve, Pierce observed. That's the best outcome we could have hoped for. They reached a stone bench near where the irrigation channels diverted from the main stream, the original channels dug by Jenkins nearly a century before, now beautifully integrated into the landscape design of the development. There's something else I wanted to discuss with you, Pierce said as they sat down. The governor has established a new commission on rural heritage preservation. It's focused on identifying and protecting historically significant agricultural properties and practices across the state. Your perspective would be invaluable if you'd consider serving as a founding commissioner. Jenkins looked surprised. At my age, surely there are younger folks better suited. Age isn't the qualification we're looking for, Pierce replied. It's wisdom, experience, and the ability to see both preservation and progress as compatible. Goals. You embody that perspective better than anyone I know. Jenkins gazed out over the stream that bore his family name, watching the water catch the morning light as it had every day of his life. I'll consider it, he said finally. Though I suspect Emily might have some ideas about that as well. As they sat in companionable silence, a class of elementary school children appeared on the opposite bank, led by their teacher, on what appeared to be a field trip. The teacher gathered them near the historical marker and began explaining the significance of Jenkins Stream and the man who had preserved it for future generations. Pierce watched Jenkins watching the children. How does it feel, he asked quietly, to see your legacy taking shape like this? Jenkins was silent for a long moment. It feels like time flowing properly, he finally said. My grandfather couldn't have imagined any of this when he first diverted that stream. He was just trying to water his crops and feed his family, but he did it with care and respect for what would come after him. He turned to Pierce, his weathered face solemn. "That's all any of us can do, Alexander. Make the best decisions we can with an eye toward those who'll come after us." Pierce nodded, understanding the profound simplicity of this philosophy that had reshaped his own professional life. The law struggles to capture that kind of long-term thinking. It's designed to resolve immediate disputes, not preserve legacies. "Perhaps that's where people like you come in," Jenkins suggested, "to remind the law of its higher purpose." As they prepared to part ways, Pierce to return to his office in the capital, Jenkins to his daily farm tasks, they paused once more. "By the bridge where they had met that morning. Same time next year?" Jenkins asked, extending his hand. "I wouldn't miss it," Pierce replied, shaking it firmly. From opposite sides of what had once been a bitter dispute, they had forged something neither could have anticipated, a friendship based on mutual respect and a shared commitment to stewardship that transcended their differences. And as they went their separate ways that day, the stream that had brought them into conflict now bound them together, a living symbol of how the right words, spoken with dignity at the right moment, could change not just a legal outcome, but the course of lives and communities for generations to come. 10 years had passed since the historic water rights case that had forever changed Millfield County. What had begun as a bitter dispute between a corporate developer and an elderly farmer had evolved into something neither party could have imagined, a blueprint for collaborative resource management that was now being studied and implemented across the country. On a warm spring morning, Emily Jenkins stood at the edge of the eastern field, surveying the land that had been in her family for 4 generations. At 38, she embodied both the traditional values of her grandfather and the forward-thinking approaches of her agricultural science education. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, her hands showing the beginning signs of the same weathering that had marked her grandfather's after decades of working the soil. Today was a significant day for both the Jenkins farm and the community. The 10th anniversary of the consent decree was being marked by an event that would bring together the key figures from the original case, along with state officials, academics, and community members. Emily checked her watch. She had just enough time to finish her morning inspection before visitors would begin arriving. As she walked along the irrigation channels, she noted with satisfaction how the modern moisture sensors she had installed were working perfectly with the century-old water distribution system. Her grandfather's wisdom and her innovations had proven to be complementary rather than contradictory. Crop yields had increased by 20% over the past 5 years, while water usage had decreased by nearly 30%. A success story. She would be presenting at the agricultural conference next month. The sound of tires on gravel drew her attention to the farmhouse driveway. A sleek government vehicle had pulled up, and Alexander Pierce emerged, now in his 50s, but still carrying himself with the same precise dignity she remembered from her youth. As the Secretary of Natural Resources for the state, a cabinet position he had been appointed to 2 years prior, he had become one of the most influential voices in regional environmental policy. "Emily," he greeted her warmly as she approached, "you're looking well. The farm seems to be thriving under your stewardship." "Secretary Pierce," she replied with a smile, shaking his hand. "Grandpa would say it's thriving because of good water and better sense." Pierce chuckled at the reference to one of Thomas Jenkins' favorite sayings. "How's he doing today? Up for visitors?" Emily nodded. "He's having one of his good days. The doctor says that at 83 he's still got more vitality than patients 20 years younger." She gestured toward the farmhouse. "He's on the porch waiting for you. Said you two have a tradition to maintain." Pierce smiled, a genuine warmth reaching his eyes. 10 years running. Wouldn't miss it for the world. As Emily led Pierce toward the house, more vehicles began arriving. Local officials, representatives from Willowbrook, members of the State Water Resources Board, and even Professor Chen, whose textbook on the Jenkins case was now required reading. In environmental law programs across the country, on the wide front porch, Thomas Jenkins sat in a rocking chair, his once sturdy frame now diminished by age, but his blue eyes still sharp and alert. A carved wooden cane rested against his chair, and a light blanket covered his legs, despite the warm spring air. When he spotted Pierce approaching, he straightened slightly, a smile creasing his weathered face. "Alexander," he called out, his voice softer than in years past, but still carrying the same quiet authority. "Right on time, as always." Pierce climbed the porch steps and clasped the elderly farmer's extended hand in both of his own. "Thomas, good to see you looking well." Jenkins gestured to the rocking chair beside his own. "Sit down and tell me what mischief you've been causing in the capital. Emily's kept me informed, but I suspect she spares me the more controversial details." As Pierce settled into the chair, Emily excused herself to greet the other arriving guests, leaving the two old friends to their annual conversation. For several minutes, they discussed Pierce's work in the state government, recent legislation affecting rural communities, and the continuing influence of what had become known in legal circles as the Jenkins Doctrine, the principle that historical water rights required deeper investigation and more nuanced resolution than standard legal processes typically allowed. "You know," Jenkins said, after a comfortable pause in their conversation, "I've been thinking lately about that day in court, the day you questioned my education." Pierce winced slightly. Even after a decade, the memory of his arrogance still made him uncomfortable. "Not my finest moment." Jenkins waved away his discomfort with a gnarled hand. "That's not why I mention it. I mention it because I've come to see that moment as something important for both of us." He gazed out over the fields where small groups of visitors were now gathering. "It was a turning point, though neither of us could have known it then." Pierce followed his gaze. "It certainly was for me. Changed the entire trajectory of my career and, frankly, my understanding of what the law should actually accomplish." Jenkins nodded thoughtfully. "For me, it was something different. It was a moment when I had to decide whether to respond with anger or with truth." He turned to look directly at Pierce. "You know, I was angry at first. Very angry. But something told me that answering anger with anger would solve nothing. Your response changed more than just our case," Pierce acknowledged. "It changed me," Jenkins smiled. "And that's what I've been thinking about. How words spoken in the right spirit can create change that lasts far beyond the moment." He gestured toward the gathering crowd in the distance. "Look at all of this. A whole community, a way of life, policies affecting thousands of people, all influenced by a simple exchange in a courtroom a decade ago." Before Pierce could respond, Emily returned to the porch, accompanied by a man in his early 30s wearing the uniform of the county records office. "Grandpa," she said, "Marcus from the county archive has brought something he thought you'd want to see before the ceremony." Marcus stepped forward nervously, clearly somewhat awed to be in the presence of the now legendary Thomas Jenkins. "Mr. Jenkins, Secretary Pierce," he began, "while digitizing the county's historical records, we discovered something I believe belongs with your family." He carefully removed a rolled document from a protective tube. "It's the original survey map, drawn by Emmett Jenkins in 1924, showing the first routing of the irrigation channels from the stream." Jenkins' eyes widened in surprise as Marcus unrolled the map on a small table between the rocking chairs. The yellowed paper showed meticulous hand-drawn lines marking the path of what was then unnamed but would later become Jenkins' stream. In the corner was his grandfather's signature, the same bold strokes that had appeared on the water rights decree that had changed everything. "He thought this was lost decades ago," Jenkins said softly, his fingers hovering just above the surface of the map, as if afraid it might dissolve at his touch. "My father searched for it after grandfather died. It was misfiled with road planning documents," Marcus explained. "We've created a digital copy for the archives, but the original rightfully belongs with your family." Jenkins looked up at the young archivist, his eyes glistening. "Thank you. This means more than you could know." As Marcus excused himself to join the gathering, Emily squeezed her grandfather's shoulder gently. "I'll have it properly preserved and framed for the farmhouse wall." Jenkins nodded, still gazing at the map with wonder. "Emmett would be pleased to see where his work has led." He looked up at his granddaughter. "And to see who's carrying it forward." The sound of vehicles approaching drew their attention. A school bus had arrived, and children from the local elementary school began filing out, supervised by their teachers. Emily smiled. "That's my cue to start the educational program. The fourth graders are here to learn about sustainable farming and water conservation." As she departed to meet the children, Jenkins turned back to Pierce. "Every year, we host the local schools. The children plant seedlings along the stream bank to maintain the watershed. Emily teaches them about how the water cycle sustains everything." "Here." Pierce watched as Emily gathered the children and began explaining something, gesturing toward the stream in the distance. "She's extraordinary, Thomas. You must be very proud." "More than words can express," Jenkins acknowledged. "She has my father's scientific mind and my wife's gentle patience, a far better combination than my own stubborn nature." Pierce chuckled. That stubborn nature served its purpose. Without it, none of this would exist today. A comfortable silence fell between them as they observed the increasing activity on the farm. Staff from the secretary's office were setting up a small podium near the stream where the formal commemoration would take place. Members of the media had begun to arrive, setting up cameras to document the event. The Jenkins case had become emblematic of a new approach to resource disputes, and its 10th anniversary was considered newsworthy across the state. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you," Pierce said finally, turning back to his old friend. "The governor has decided to establish a permanent endowment for the Jenkins Water Rights Scholarship at the State University. It will support students studying agricultural sustainability and water law, with preference given to those from farming families." Jenkins' eyes widened. "That's quite an honor, Alexander." "It's well-deserved," Pierce replied. "Your case has directly influenced 17 state laws and policies regarding water rights in the past decade. The scholarship will ensure that influence continues for generations." Jenkins shook his head in wonder. "All because of a dispute over an old stream." "Not just the dispute," Pierce corrected gently. "It was how you responded to it. Your dignity in the face of arrogance, your wisdom when confronted with mere knowledge, your willingness to find common ground rather than simply fight for total victory." He smiled. "Those are the lessons the scholarship aims to perpetuate." Jenkins gazed out at the land his family had tended for nearly a century. "You know what my grandfather used to say about water rights? He said water doesn't care who owns it. It just wants to flow where it's meant to go." I've always thought there was a lesson in that about how to handle disagreements. Find the natural path where both sides can flow together. Pierce nodded. Exactly what we ended up doing. As the time for the formal ceremony approached, Emily returned to help her grandfather to his feet. With Pierce on one side and Emily on the other, Thomas Jenkins made his way slowly down the porch steps. The gathered crowd noticed his approach, and a respectful hush fell as he walked toward the podium area. Children from the school group lined the path, some holding handmade signs thanking Mr. Jenkins for protecting the stream. Community members nodded in respect as he passed. Even Richard Harmon, now retired from Willowbrook but present for the anniversary, stood a little straighter as Jenkins approached. As they reached the ceremonial area by the stream, Jenkins paused, looking out over the water that had sustained his family for generations and would now continue to do so while also supporting the community that had grown alongside it. In that moment, the connection between past and future, between tradition and progress, between conflict and resolution, was almost palpable. "Ready, Grandpa?" Emily asked softly. Jenkins nodded, drawing himself up to his full height despite his years. "Ready as I've ever been." With a glance at Pierce that communicated decades of mutual respect, he stepped forward to address the gathered crowd, a living testimony to the power of dignified words spoken at precisely the right moment. 20 years had passed since the courtroom confrontation that changed the course of Millfield County's history. Thomas Jenkins had passed away peacefully 3 winters ago at the age of 90, leaving behind a legacy that extended far beyond the boundaries of his farm. The funeral had drawn hundreds from across the state, including the governor, who had declared a day of remembrance for a man whose wisdom taught us all that true progress honors the past while embracing the future. On this bright June morning, Alexander Pierce stood before a gathered crowd on the campus of State University. At 65, his hair had turned completely silver, but his posture remained straight and his voice clear as he addressed the audience. Behind him stood an impressive new building of glass and sustainable materials, designed to harmonize with the natural landscape, much like Jenkins Stream Estates had done 2 decades earlier. Today, we dedicate the Thomas Jenkins Center for Agricultural Sustainability and Water Rights, Pierce announced, his voice carrying across the assembled dignitaries, students, and community members. This center represents everything Thomas stood for, the belief that with proper stewardship, we can honor our agricultural heritage while embracing innovation and sustainable practices. In the front row sat Emily Jenkins Rodriguez, now 53 and the nationally recognized director of the Rural Heritage Conservation Alliance. Beside her was her husband Miguel, their 2 college-aged children, and her mother, Martha Jenkins. Now in her 80s, but still sharp-minded, the family listened with quiet pride as Pierce continued his dedication speech. 20 years ago, I stood in a courtroom and made the mistake of confusing education with wisdom, Pierce said, his voice softening with the memory. Thomas Jenkins taught all of us, that the most profound knowledge often comes from generations of lived experience and deep connection to the land. He gestured toward the building behind him. This center will bring together farmers, legal scholars, hydrologists, environmental scientists, and community advocates to ensure that water rights disputes are resolved with the same wisdom, dignity, and foresight that Thomas demonstrated. It will house the state's most comprehensive archive of water rights documentation, accessible to all communities facing similar challenges. As Pierce concluded his remarks, Emily stepped forward to cut the ceremonial ribbon. Cameras flashed as the Jenkins Center was officially opened, its mission to become a living embodiment of her grandfather's legacy now beginning in earnest. Following the ceremony, Pierce and Emily walked through the center's main hall, where photographs and artifacts told the story of the landmark case. The centerpiece was a beautifully preserved display containing Emmett Jenkins' original irrigation map alongside the 1937 Water Rights Decree. Beside them was a framed transcript of Thomas Jenkins' famous courtroom response about the difference between education and wisdom. Grandfather would have been embarrassed by all this attention, Emily remarked with a gentle smile. He never saw himself as doing anything extraordinary, Pierce nodded. That was part of his greatness. He never set out to make history or create precedent. He was simply standing up for what was right in the most dignified way he knew how. They paused before a large photograph showing Thomas Jenkins and Alexander Pierce standing together by Jenkins' stream on the 10th anniversary of the consent decree. The image captured a moment of genuine friendship between two men who had begun as adversaries. "I still miss our annual conversations," Pierce admitted. "Your grandfather had a way of cutting through complexity to the heart of any issue." Emily squeezed his arm affectionately. "He always looked forward to those meetings, said you were the only government man who really understood the difference between managing resources and stewarding them." As they continued their tour, they were approached by a young law student whose name badge identified her as Gabriela Morales, the first recipient of the Jenkins Water Rights Scholarship. "Secretary Pierce, Ms. Jenkins Rodriguez," she greeted them respectfully. "I just wanted to thank you both for establishing this center. My family has been farming in the western part of the state for 4 generations, and we're currently facing our own water rights challenge with a mining company. The precedents established by your case have been invaluable in our legal preparation." Emily smiled warmly at the young woman. "My grandfather would be pleased to know his experiences helping other farming families. Are you familiar with the details of our case?" "Yes, ma'am." Gabriela nodded eagerly. "It's the cornerstone case study in my environmental law program. Professor Chen's textbook dedicates 3 chapters to it, and we've studied the full transcript." She turned to Pierce. "In fact, sir, your apology and subsequent career change are cited as an example of how legal professionals can evolve their understanding of justice beyond merely winning cases." Pierce raised an eyebrow, simultaneously amused and humbled. "I wasn't aware my personal redemption arc had become required reading." "It humanizes the law," Gabriela explained earnestly. "It reminds us that behind every case are real people capable of growth and change." After speaking with several more students and faculty members, Pierce and Emily made their way outside to a quiet courtyard where a bronze statue of Thomas Jenkins stood. The sculpture depicted him as he had been in his later years, leaning slightly on his cane, his expression conveying both strength and gentleness. The plaque below contained his most famous quote, "There's a difference between intelligence and wisdom, between education and knowledge." As they stood before the statue, a group of elementary school children on a field trip filed into the courtyard, led by their teacher who gathered them around the sculpture. "This is Mr. Thomas Jenkins," the teacher explained to the attentive children. "He was a farmer who taught us all an important lesson about standing up for what's right and doing it with dignity and respect." Emily and Pierce stepped back, watching, as the teacher told a simplified version of the water rights case to the children. Even reduced to its essentials for young minds, the story retained its power. How an elderly farmer faced with mockery had responded not with anger, but with wisdom, changing hearts and minds in the process. "We're reading a story about Mr. Jenkins in our class," one child announced proudly. "It's called The Farmer's Wisdom." Emily glanced at Pierce with surprise. "I didn't know grandfather's story had made it into children's literature." "There's actually a whole series of educational materials based on the case now," Pierce explained. "The State Department of Education includes it in their curriculum on civic engagement and environmental stewardship. Your grandfather has become something of a folk hero to a generation that never knew him." As the children continued their tour, Emily and Pierce made their way toward the university's agricultural fields, where the practical research component of the Jenkins Center would be implemented. The experimental plots demonstrated various irrigation techniques, from the traditional methods Thomas Jenkins had employed to cutting-edge precision systems developed in the university's engineering department. "You know what amazes me most about all this?" Emily said as they walked between rows of thriving crops. "How a single moment in a courtroom could create such lasting change. If grandfather had responded differently that day, if he'd become angry or defensive when you mocked his education, none of this would exist. Pierce nodded thoughtfully. I've thought about that many times over the years. There's a profound lesson there about how we respond to provocation and disrespect. Thomas chose dignity over outrage, wisdom over retaliation. In doing so, he didn't just win his case, he changed the entire conversation. They reached a small memorial garden at the edge of the research fields, a tranquil space where a portion of Thomas Jenkins' ashes had been interred at his request. A simple stone marker bore his name, the dates of his life, and the words, "His wisdom flows like water, nourishing all it touches." Emily knelt to place a small stone on top of the marker, a family tradition. Sometimes I come here when facing difficult decisions about the farm or my advocacy work, she admitted. I find myself asking, what would Grandpa say about this? Pierce smiled. And can you hear his answers? Almost always, she replied, rising to her feet. Usually something straightforward and wise that makes me wonder why I was overcomplicating things in the first place. They shared a knowing laugh, both intimately familiar with Thomas Jenkins's gift for simplifying complex issues to their essence. As they walked back toward the main campus, they passed two law professors engaged in animated discussion about a recent Supreme Court decision on indigenous water rights. The Jenkins doctrine clearly applies here, one was saying emphatically. Historical usage should take precedence over later administrative designations. Pierce and Emily exchanged a smile at the casual reference to what had once been simply a farmer standing up for his family's rights. I sometimes wonder if he fully understood the impact he would have, Pierce mused. Not just on water law, but on how we approach conflict resolution more broadly. Emily considered this. I asked him something similar once, a few years before he passed. He said he wasn't thinking about making history or creating doctrines. He was just trying to explain to a young lawyer that there are different kinds of knowledge in the world, and all of them have value. A simple truth that changed everything. Pierce nodded. As they reached the university's main quadrangle, they found hundreds of students gathering for the symposium that would officially inaugurate the academic programs of the Jenkins Center. Scholars from across the country had come to present research on sustainable water management, agricultural preservation, and collaborative approaches to resource disputes. The legacy of one farmer's dignified response to mockery had grown into a movement that was reshaping how an entire generation thought about the relationship between law, land, and community. Standing at the edge of this gathering, Alexander Pierce, once the embodiment of corporate legal arrogance, now a respected elder statesman of environmental policy, felt a profound sense of gratitude for the man who had shown him a better path. He glanced at Emily, seeing in her face echoes of her grandfather's quiet strength and unwavering principles. He would have been proud of all this, Pierce said softly, but most of all, he would have been proud of you, Emily. You've carried his wisdom forward and expanded it in ways he could never have imagined. Emily smiled, her eyes bright with emotion. The best tribute to grandfather isn't this building or the programs it will house. It's that his story continues to teach people that sometimes the most powerful response to disrespect isn't anger or retaliation. It's the calm assertion of truth spoken with dignity. Together, they walked toward the future Thomas Jenkins had helped create, a future where wisdom and formal education were understood as complementary rather than competing forms of knowledge, where progress and heritage reinforced rather than opposed each other, and where the simple dignity of a farmer's response to mockery continued to ripple outward, touching lives and shaping communities in ways that no one could have predicted on that fateful day in court, 20 years before. 50 years had passed since the day a simple farmer stood in a county courthouse and responded to a lawyer's mockery. With words that would echo through generations. The world had changed dramatically in those 5 decades. Climate patterns had shifted, technology had transformed agriculture, and new challenges faced rural communities across the nation. Yet the wisdom born in that courtroom moment continued to flow like the stream that had started it all, nourishing new minds and hearts with each passing year. In the Great Hall of the National Agricultural Heritage Museum in Washington, D.C., a special exhibition was opening to commemorate the 50th anniversary of what historians now called the Jenkins watershed case. The exhibition, titled Wisdom of the Land, How One Farmer Changed American Environmental Law, had drawn visitors from across the country. Among them was Sophia Jenkins Martinez, Thomas Jenkins' great-granddaughter, and the current steward of Jenkins Farm. At 35, she represented the 5th generation to work the land that Emmett Jenkins had first irrigated with waters from what was still called Jenkins Stream. Under her guidance, the farm had evolved into a nationally recognized center for sustainable agricultural practices while maintaining its deep connection to traditional farming wisdom. As Sophia moved through the exhibition, she paused before the centerpiece display, a life-sized recreation of the Millfield County Courthouse scene where her great-grandfather had delivered his famous response about the difference between education and wisdom. The exhibit included audio recordings of actors recreating the exchange, along with interviews with people who had been present that day, including a court reporter who had never forgotten the powerful silence that had fallen after Thomas Jenkins' words. "It's quite something, isn't it?" said a voice beside her. Sophia turned to find an elderly man in his 90s, impeccably dressed despite his advanced age, using a walker for support. Though his face was deeply lined and his shoulders slightly bent, his eyes were clear and alert. "Judge Pierce," she said with warm recognition, offering her hand. "I wasn't sure you'd be able to make it today." Alexander Pierce, retired from the Supreme Court after serving 15 years as an Associate Justice, smiled as he shook her hand. "I wouldn't have missed it, Sophia. Some commemorations transcend personal convenience." At 95, Pierce was among the last living participants from the original case. His appointment to the Supreme Court at 75 had been considered unusual at the time, but his unique perspective on environmental law and his landmark decisions on water rights had justified the president's confidence in him. His judicial philosophy, heavily influenced by his experience with Thomas Jenkins, had helped reshape American jurisprudence on natural resource management for decades to come. Together, they moved slowly through the exhibition, pausing frequently to allow Pierce to rest. They stopped before a wall displaying the global impact of what had become known internationally as the Jenkins approach, a methodology for resolving resource disputes that emphasized historical context, intergenerational equity, and collaborative solutions rather than winner-take-all litigation. "They're using great-grandpa's approach to resolve water conflicts in regions I'm not sure he even knew existed," Sophia remarked, noting the map showing implementations across 5 continents. Pierce nodded. "I remember when the UN Water Rights Commission first adopted the framework. The delegate from Kenya said something I've never forgotten, that Thomas Jenkins had articulated a truth that transcended cultural boundaries because it spoke to the universal human experience of working with the land." They continued to another section dedicated to the educational impact of the case. A video display showed classrooms around the world where children were learning about the Jenkins case through interactive programs. In one clip, students in Japan were performing a play about the courtroom confrontation, while in another, high school students in Brazil were conducting a moot court exercise based on the case's principles. "Your great-grandfather would have been astonished," Pierce said quietly. "He never sought attention or acclaim. He just wanted to protect his stream." Mum says he would have been horrified by all this fuss, Sophia agreed with a smile, but secretly pleased that his words helped so many people. As they approached the final section of the exhibition, they were greeted by Michael Chen, grandson of Professor Lisa Chen, who had written the definitive textbook on the case decades earlier. Now, the curator of the exhibition, he guided them to a special display he wanted them to see. "This just arrived yesterday," he explained, indicating a sealed, climate-controlled case containing a leather-bound journal. "We discovered it in the State University archives during research for this exhibition." Pierce leaned forward, squinting slightly to read the displayed page. His eyes widened in recognition. "That's my handwriting," he said with surprise. "That's the journal I kept during the 2 weeks between our first court appearance and the settlement discussions." Chen nodded. "You donated your papers to the university's law library after your retirement from the Supreme Court. This journal was among them, but its significance wasn't fully recognized until our researchers connected it to the Jenkins case." Pierce read the displayed entry aloud, his voice growing stronger as he reconnected with his younger self. "Meeting with Jenkins today at his farm changed everything. I went there convinced I would offer him a settlement that would satisfy his pride while securing our legal position. I left questioning everything I've been taught about what it means to practice law. When he showed me the irrigation channels his grandfather dug by hand, when he spoke about the generations of knowledge embedded in how that water flows across his land, I realized I've been on the wrong side of this case from the beginning. Not just legally wrong, but morally wrong. There's a wisdom in his relationship to that land that no law degree could ever provide. I need to find a way to preserve that wisdom while still serving my client. More importantly, I need to re-examine what serving the law truly means." Pierce fell silent, momentarily transported back 50 years to that pivotal day on the Jenkins farm. Sophia gently touched his arm, moved by this glimpse into the profound impact her great-grandfather had had on the young lawyer who would become a Supreme Court justice. "That visit to the farm was when everything changed for me," Pierce said finally. "I'd spent my career believing that the law was primarily about technicalities and precedents. Your great-grandfather showed me that at its heart, the law should be about wisdom and justice." As they continued toward the exhibition's conclusion, they were approached by a group of law students who recognized Justice Pierce. With respectful enthusiasm, they asked if he would share any reflections on how the Jenkins case had influenced his judicial philosophy. Pierce considered the question thoughtfully. "The Jenkins case taught me that the most profound legal wisdom often comes from outside the legal profession entirely. Throughout my career, whether as a government official or a Supreme Court justice, I tried to remember that legal expertise is only valuable when it's informed by a deeper understanding of how real people live with the consequences of our decisions." He gestured toward the exhibition around them. Thomas Jenkins never set foot in a law school, but he understood more about justice than most attorneys I've known. He taught me that genuine wisdom often speaks in simple language, while mere knowledge often hides behind complexity. As the students thanked him and moved on, Pierce and Sophia found themselves at the exhibition's final installation, a beautifully crafted meditation space designed around the theme of flowing water. A gentle stream circulated through the room, with Thomas Jenkins' words inscribed along its path. "These calluses came from work that fed people. Can you say the same about yours?" They sat together on a bench beside the water feature, the sound of flowing water creating a peaceful backdrop for reflection. "Justice Pierce," Sophia said after a comfortable silence, "do you think Great-Grandpa had any idea what he was starting that day in court?" Pierce smiled. "No, and that's what made his wisdom so powerful. He wasn't trying to create legal precedent or start a movement. He was simply speaking his truth with dignity. The most profound changes often begin that way, not with someone trying to change the world, but with someone refusing to compromise their principles, even when faced with mockery or dismissal. Sophia nodded, watching the water flow past the inscribed words. I've tried to remember that in my own work. When corporations approach us about selling the farm or industrial agriculture representatives challenge our methods, I try to respond with that same dignified truth rather than defensiveness. And has it worked? Pierce asked. Not always immediately, she admitted. But over time, yes. 3 agribusiness executives who once criticized our outdated approach now send their staff to train with us. One even enrolled his daughter in our apprenticeship program. Pierce nodded with satisfaction. The stream keeps flowing, carrying wisdom to new shores. As the afternoon light began to fade, museum staff approached to let them know a special reception would be beginning soon. Leaders in environmental law, sustainable agriculture, and water rights advocacy from around the world had gathered to honor the legacy of Thomas Jenkins and the case that had transformed their fields. Before they joined the reception, Sophia and Pierce paused at the exhibition's guest book. Pierce leaned heavily on his walker as he carefully signed his name below a comment he had written. 50 years ago, a lawyer mocked a farmer's education, and the farmer's response changed them both forever. May we all have the wisdom to recognize that true knowledge often comes from unexpected sources, and the courage to change our course when we encounter it. Beside him, Sophia added her own entry. My great-grandfather always said that water doesn't care about property lines or legal documents. It just wants to flow where it's meant to go. His wisdom has flowed far beyond what he could have imagined, nourishing minds and hearts across generations. I am honored to continue tending the source. Together, they made their way to join the gathering that had assembled to commemorate not just a legal case, but a moment when dignity triumphed over mockery, when wisdom transcended formal education, and when a simple farmer's words began a journey that would transform how humanity viewed its relationship with the land and water that sustains us all. The legacy of Thomas Jenkins, farmer, water steward, and unwitting philosopher, had become eternal, flowing like the stream that still bore his name, nourishing new generations with the simple, profound wisdom born in a moment of quiet dignity in a small-town courtroom 50 years before. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.